I'm here with Safron Rossi. Safron, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Really, thank you, Brian, for the invitation. It's always a treat to be able to have a conversation about ideas and people whose work really inspire us. So I'm looking forward to talking about some of these things with you.
Great. I became aware of you because my wife's a professional astrologer, and we've been together for about 15 years, and we've always had the kind of relationship where there's a lot of cross pollination. And depth psychology is something that I've been into for a while. And so discovering all of the descendants of Jung and their work, and Debbie's really into the history of astrology and all of that. So I've been picking up some of the astrology through osmosis. She gives me little readings spontaneously all of the time. When I talk about something that's going on in my life, she goes, "Oh, well, of course, Venus
Right.
is trine your Mercury or whatever." And then she's been picking up some of the depth psychology from me. And it's an area where she's starting to dig into more and more because she sees that it'll help deepen her work with her clients in her consultations. And so she came across your work, and we listened to one of your lectures together on archetypal astrology and the work of James Hillman and how that informs your approach to astrology. And I really appreciated the way that you were able to take Hillman's ideas and present them in a way that felt really clear and relatable.
Mm.
Because Hillman can be a really difficult writer and thinker to get into,
Mm.
unless I think you have a really strong foundation in kind of classical Jungian psychology.
Right.
Um, so I really just wanted to praise you for your ability to take some of those complex ideas of his and put them together in a really clear and relatable way.
Mm.
It's really great, and I think it's a great entry point for a lot of people interested in this work.
Thank you so much. Hellman's work has been really central in many ways for me, and um, finding a way to mm, translate, I don't even know if that's the right word, but finding a way to incorporate some of his vitalizing and rich and powerful ways of thinking about the psyche and what soul making is about in life, and what it is to be psychologically aware. He shows up so little in astrological conversation, and given my orientation to astrology as necessarily needing imaginative language by which to move into the symbols. I think Hillman is a really um, important teacher in that way. So that particular talk that you're referencing, it I was endeavoring to try to talk about Hellman's really sort of unique and radical ways of looking at what the psyche does, and weaving that into how we, archetypally and psychologically oriented astrologers, like what we're doing and what it is that we're kind of reaching for and working with, um, in the symbolic art, but then in relationship to the person that comes to us, looking for insight, understanding, clarity of some kind.
Hmm. You know, um, I wonder if we could just go back in time a little bit and talk
Mhm.
about your journey toward this kind of approach. And so, if you could tell us a little bit about how you initially got into astrology and then
Yeah.
where you encountered the work of James Hillman, that would be great.
Yeah. So I encountered Hillman's work first as a graduate student at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. So I went through the mythological studies program there. That's what my PhD is in, myth, with an emphasis in depth psychology. And so I hadn't really heard of Hillman until I had applied to be in graduate school. And I was in my early 20s, and but always had a lifelong passion for myth. And so I knew that this is what I wanted to study. And so it was in the program that I was introduced to his work by two professors that we had. One was Dr. Jeanette Paris, who is an archetypal psychologist and a Canadian, but Montreal,
Mhm.
and also Glenn Slater, who is also an archetypal psychologist and professor at Pacifica. And so they were the two that really represented the significance of Hillman's work in the field of depth psychology. And then the second piece is, Hillman, for those that are somewhat familiar with him, like yourself, he's deeply mythological, isn't he? Like all of his writing. So being in a myth program that had an emphasis in depth psychology, I mean, Hillman's the most mythological depth psychologist. And so he was a very natural fit in the sort of course of the study. So that was so I studied him in that way. I was really fortunate to be at Pacifica at a time when Hillman would actually do sabbaticals there. And so I had him as a teacher in the classroom. So that was kind of awe-inspiring and a bit nerve-wracking because of just the his genius, and that he was a very sort of direct speaker. So Pacifica was the ground where I was exposed to Hillman, both in his written work and then directly as a teacher and a person. And then astrology came in to my purview when I was working on my dissertation, but mostly toward the end. And I think part of what was going on was, as you know, when you've toward the end of any major creative project, there can often be a sort of falling away of like interest, like all the libido, all the energy that was like going into this project. Once it's toward the end, it's kind of like, I finished that. I don't think there's a single thing I care about in the world. Like there's this strange, well, it's not strange, but it's that sort of the falling away of any psychic energy for anything. And I kind of felt that way at the end of my dissertation. And at the time, I was working in the archives, Opus Archives and Research Center, which is actually located on the campuses of Pacifica.
No, that's the Joseph Campbell archives?
That's right. And it also had the James Hillman collection. And so I was the assistant to the director, and she had tickets to go to a talk in Santa Barbara that Rick Tarnas was giving. Not a big one, it wasn't a huge like Pacifica conference. It was actually just put together by a group of people who were affiliated with Pacifica, but at the university club. And so Tarnas was coming down to do like a 2-hour, much smaller group thing. So I'm sitting there. My boss couldn't go. She gave me her ticket. And so I'm there, and Tarnas starts talking. I don't even remember exactly what. I have the notes somewhere, but he starts laying out some of the themes in terms of the current transits, and then breaking that down archetypally, and then talking about myth. And something just happened for me where I realized that all these years of study in the myth program, explicitly studying the mythic and religious symbols and narratives and images from cultures all around the globe, and then understanding Jung and Hillman's archetypal model of the psyche. Listening to Tarnas, I realized that astrology was a practice where those things were wedded together, um, in a way that, is a sort of meditative art, a profoundly healing tool for self-inquiry and understanding. And so something just happened where I saw the relationship between these three things. And so all of a sudden, where there was no libido, there was. It was like my imagination got really immediately fired by this. And so that led to my beginning to study it. So, and then amazing synchronicities happen. So, for example, my neighbor at the time was an astrologer, and she had an old school correspondence course. You remember those, where like you would like send away? So she had this whole astrology correspondence course in these big, big binders with the answer keys. And so she basically lent them to me indefinitely. And so I just started to study. And
Do you remember who the course was from?
I don't. No, and it was really like, I think it might have been printed out on like a dot matrix printer. Like it was really
Did
like
it
from the past.
did it have cassette tapes in the back?
No, there were no cassette tapes. No, it was just chapter after chapter of information, and then exercises, and then your little test. And so I was really starting from the ground, like memorizing the glyphs and all of the different symbols and the different keywords, really rudimentary. But I already had all of my studies in archetypal psychology and mythology. So like I was just trying to get into the way that it was communicated in this ancient art. But I was very quickly able to, make the connections.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so that,
if I
yeah,
could just pause for a moment,
yeah,
that experience of going to see Rick Tarnas and everything just kind of coming together for you. I really have a felt sense of what that was like, because I've had those kind of experiences before. It's like
yeah.
where, excuse the pun, totally unintentional, but where the stars align and things just like click together for
Yeah,
you,
that's
right?
right.
Like all of these different threads are all of a sudden part of a larger tapestry. And there is something about astrology that I think is really quite unique. Like, so there's maybe we could help expand people's understanding of Jung and Hillman's view of what the archetypes are and how they live in the psyche and how they function and stuff. But there's an idea that myths are an expression of these archetypal patterns and energies in the form of stories. And, stories and myths are still quite ephemeral. They're always changing, they're always morphing. There's different versions of Greek myths and all that. But there's something about the projection of the archetypal patterns and energies onto the planets in the sky that makes it more real. It's like it's crossed the boundary of some kind, and all of a sudden it's there, and it's there for all time for everyone to observe and engage with. That
Mm,
is quite unique, isn't it?
mhm, mhm. Yeah, this the way the planets are, in a way, sort of, they're concrete and imaginal, or symbolic, bodies or carriers for the archetypal imagination. And they are present in terms of our daily, nightly lived experience. And it's quite astonishing, the way in which the celestial firmament, I mean, has always, for all cultures, really been the abode of the divine powers, at least one of them. I mean, so is the earth and then the underworld, but the heavens have always been associated with, um, the powers of the universe. Um, and so the way we can relate to that, for Tarnas, I mean, Tarnas is extraordinary contribution to the melding of these worlds, astrology, transpersonal psychology, but also Jungian psychology, is really so important because he makes the explicit sort of psychological shift, which is that, as he says in Cosmos and Psyche, his sort of opus magnum, I suppose, although his book Passion of a Western Mind is equally an opus. So he's got two opus, I suppose. What Tarnas says is that astrology is archetypally predictive, and yet we have this extraordinary synchronicity that is with us every day with the movements of the planets, the visible planets, and the events and the perspectives that we bring to life. So yeah, it's really, there's a lot of mystery, to the astrological art and the phenomenology of it as well.
Yeah, the phenomenology of it is what really kind of boggles my mind
Mm-hmm.
because I'm used to engaging with things that have a, a symbolic meaning to them, and things that receive our projection of these archetypal movements within us or impulses within us. But with the planets and the stars, there seems to be a two-way influence or something. Like they're receiving our projection, we're putting these archetypes onto them, but they're also deserving of those archetypal designations in some way, and they seem to have an influence on us, which is something that blows my mind every time Debbie goes into my chart. I'm amazed at how accurately it describes my life and experience. It's
Mm-hmm.
incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this and I mean, this goes to the Jung's uh, idea about the nature of the psyche being archetypally patterned. And by psyche, he wasn't just referring to our individual, sense of self, but life itself, nature, and the archetypes, point to the instinctive, most biological primary aspects of our nature, as well as what we would call the most spiritual, archetypal, symbolic, capacities of the mind and experience. But the connection of our individual experience, um, and these planets as symbolizing the movement of and the interrelationship and configurations of certain archetypal energies and patterns at any given time, really is extraordinary, and how our this practice has developed over a very long, we could say, attentiveness, a sort of qualitative attentiveness to the correlations that exist between human events, celestial movements, and then how do we come to understand that. So that's where the whole idea of astrology is really um, being about, or it has the worldview, or the worldview of astrology is really about time as being qualitative, right? There are qualities to time, and those qualities um, are descriptive of and live in people and places and historical events. It's as if everything is kind of colored by these particular qualities. And in a way, that's another way that we can understand archetypes, is that they're particular qualities of consciousness,
Hmm.
right? So yeah.
Yeah. Qualities of consciousness, and I also think of them sometimes as modes of being, like
Yes.
when we're tuned into a particular archetypal energy, and it's not something that we're necessarily doing consciously, although
Right.
there are ways to invoke different energetic patterns in us. It really shapes the way we engage with the world.
Yes, absolutely. Behavior, consciousness. Yes, and Jung talked about archetypes as modes of perception. Um, Hillman really emphasized archetypes as um, um, sort of imaginative fields, but always the qualitative whatness, is what we're needing to pay attention to, and those are personified, by mythic figures, and yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
So when you're engaged in astrology as part of your praxis or your lifestyle, you must just be noticing synchronicities all of the time. Does that ever get distracting?
um wow, that's such an interesting question. um No, I very much, I don't find synchronicities distracting. I think they're extraordinary. And to me, I relate to them as like invitations to stop and pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you feel the same way?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. But it just seems like with astrology, because you are talking about time and every moment in time related to the place, related to your station, there are so many opportunities to notice these synchronicities that it could take you
Mm.
away from your mundane responsibilities in the world. Like,
Oh, I see. Right. I see. Yes. Well, in my own, I think that there are times when, let's say, there's more afoot, and I might get really caught in doing research and sort of responding to a synchronicity, i.e., seeing a particular pattern showing up in a number of charts, or something in my own chart that I'm really interested in, and the way that that's relating to something that I'm dealing with, or trying to understand in my life. So there are these like discrete periods where there can be this real intense um, engagement with that. Um, so I think, again, it comes down to uh, sort of the temperature of the synchronicity, like how strong
mm,
it is, versus, when you practice with anything that very explicitly is dipped into and resonant to these patterns of life. Yeah, you have to start to make some uh, sense of, what really needs to be pursued, and what just is part of the the nature of the work, and what keeps showing up.
yeah. So there's
And
going to
taking
be,
notes.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, like noting synchronicities and really paying attention to the ones that seem significant because they feel
Yeah.
like somewhat more charged or, yeah.
Yes. And I think that you know our the way that might relate to our dreams, or other parts of the psyche in response to what's going on in life. I think that help underscores some of the particular heat that something might really be carrying, and wanting attention.
Hmm. You mentioned, a little aspect of Jung and Hillman's thinking about archetypes where there's like a slight difference in the way that they might frame it or think about it or describe archetypes. I'm wondering, what do you see as some significant differences between classical Jungian psychology and what Hillman developed? He's often considered a post-Jungian, and I
Mhm.
don't know if he ever self-identified as that, but he definitely was kind of moving Jung's thinking forward in his
Mhm.
own particular way, following his
Yeah.
own interests in Greek myth and things like that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a really good question. Um, I think that, for Hillman, if we were to try to distinguish, like I mean, it's an interesting thing. So just kind of letting all the little thoughts sort of come into a little bit of order. I think that in many ways, Hillman has been one of the most um, dedicated depth psychologists or Jungians to Jung's like fundamental ideas. So on one hand, I think Hillman is incredibly true to Jung's formulations of the psyche and how to be present and how to work with the psyche and these sort of core insights that were Jung's. I think when it comes to Jungian psychology, that's where Hillman, really kind of steps away.
Mm.
But to the master Jung, I think there's an extraordinary closeness, and that was very important to Hillman. So that's one part of it. But in terms of the Jung, like the way we'd position Hillman in relationship to Jungian psychology, is that he really didn't go in for the sort of conceptual modeling of the psyche that I think you see, Jungians developed.
Mhm.
Um, and he was also more interested in exploring what myth are we in when we're in our psychology. So he had this sort of meta question and concern for the very things that drive our perceptions or modalities of doing this healing practice or whatever it is. So I would say then, and I'm core faculty at Pacifica in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program. So our mission in the program is to educate people in the core ideas that belong to these two fields, and archetypal psychology, of course, being an offshoot of Jungian psychology. But I don't think there can be a really sharp cut between Jung and Hillman. I would say it's kind of a matter of emphases.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that Hillman really emphasized the qualitative imaginal field of the archetypes. Like that's why myth and alchemy and the colors of alchemy were so important, because it was is an understanding that the archetypes of the collective unconscious, they we experience them and are in contact with them through the forms of the imagination. And that's where myth and religion and literature and art, ritual and dance and theater, I mean, all of the kind of cultural outpourings of human civilization are so important, because they are the expressions of the archetypal energies of life coming into form.
Mm.
And so for Hillman, that's what we can look at. That's what we can hold and explore and circumambulate and then begin to imagine into psychologically in terms of our behavior or our consciousness or our, principal ideas or concerns or values. So yeah, so I would say that it's the qualitative emphasis that really, I think, sets Hillman apart perhaps from Jung in some sense.
Mm. Or the Jungians.
The Jungians, yeah, the
Yeah.
Jungian, right.
Yeah, one thing you'll notice in Hillman's books is you'll never see diagrams of the
Right,
psyche, which
right.
these Jungians really love, trying to
Mm-hmm.
map out the psyche in really clear and defined ways. And I mean, I'm a visual person. I really like those charts, but the map
Right.
is not the territory for sure. There's no way
Right.
a chart can describe the complexity of the psyche. Yeah, I think I really feel what you're talking about in terms of how Hillman's approach is distinguished from this kind of classical Jungian approach. And maybe one of the key things that jumps out for me is his complete resistance to interpretation,
Hmm.
to stepping back from the experience and trying to figure out what it means.
Hmm.
You hear him say things like that a lot, like the admonishment that we don't interpret the dream interprets us.
Right.
And as soon as I say the black snake in my dream is the devouring mother, I've killed the snake.
Right.
And so he was
Right.
always saying, like, don't kill the snake. What does the snake want?
Right.
What is the snake doing now?
Right.
Not just happening in the past in your dream, but the snake is here right now, and things like that. So is that what you're talking about with that the qualitative experience?
That's right. So there's another example that I really love, and um, Glenn Slater, who's my colleague as well as my husband, was the editor of Hillman's Senex and Puer volume in the uniform edition. So he's very, very deeply steeped in Hillman's work. And there's an anecdote that Glenn often gives that of what he heard Hillman say during a talk. And I just think it's so like perfectly Hillman, which is that it's this whole idea of like life is like a pearl necklace, but don't worry about the string. Just pay attention to the pearls, i.e.,
Mm.
don't worry about the way this whole thing hangs together and like what it means and like where did you start and where is it going and like forget that. Pay attention to the pearls, like these events. I mean, and one of Hillman's ways of defining soul is that it's events that become experiences, right? That's soul, that it's the deepening of life events into those pearls of who we are or know ourselves to be. So this paying attention to the whatness, that the things that we encounter, and like letting the whole issue of the string or the individuation journey, like where am I on my individuation path, like letting all of that fall to the background and paying attention to what's appearing, like the snake, or the shattering betrayal, and the way that life is, that soul is made in those experiences of life that become these precious gems or jewels, that somehow belong to us or to which we belong.
Mm. Yeah, I like how you brought in even just the experience of life,
Mhm.
paying attention to that, what is actually happening in that experience
Right.
without, because it's always about that step back to analyze what's happening and then how do I get rid of it. And the step
Mhm.
back is already a defense from
Mhm.
being in the experience itself and letting it cook you in the alchemical oven of life and maturation or
Mhm.
something, right?
Mhm.
So he
That's
was
right.
very, yeah. The pearl analogy made me smile because one of the ways I think about Hillman as is like a deconstructionist. Like he really, he never really talked about those structures that a lot of other Jungians have gotten super infatuated with.
Right.
Always looking to see like what's the mapping out the underlying structure of the psyche and all this kind
Right.
of thing. And I never got that from him. And I sometimes say to people who are interested in this work is, I say be really careful with getting too enamored of Hillman right away,
Mm.
because he is in my opinion, a deconstructionist, and he can deconstruct things so much, and he's such a kind of poetic writer, and he can really draw you into his ideas. And he can kind of leave you with no foundation if you're not careful. So I always
Mm,
suggest get a good grounding in some like classical Jungian theory, understand what the different structures are of the psyche that people have come up with, and then
mhm.
like drop in some Hillman and like homeopathic doses so you don't get too you don't get too enamored of the structural diagrams and all that stuff. You start to hold them
Mhm.
more lightly and use them really as a map that, we consciously know is not the territory, so let's not hold too tightly to that. But otherwise, Hillman can really throw you for a loop, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's something to do with his rhetorical style, which is that um, he'll argue the opposite position in an effort to unpack and unfold and explore these different grounds that we can stand on looking at things. And it can often we people in our program will talk about, oh, Hillman drives me crazy, like where does he stand,
Yeah.
what is his perspective, and it's like, well, it shifts, it changes, and he's not interested in trying to keep a kind of cohesive, like theoretical position on something, except for the great fundamentals, which is the imaginative power of the psyche, myth as being the psyche's irreducible. Well, I think one of the ways he puts it is that myth is the root, like the root tongue, the root metaphors of the psyche. I mean, there are these fundamental things, um, but barring that, he's not interested in being fixed. So yeah, I like your the image of these. I get an image of like flower essences. It's like like taking in a little tincture when this is new territory for people, for sure. But Hillman too is so bold and brilliant and has such a deep, um, in many ways, sort of. I often feel reading Hillman that, and to sort of lean into the astrological side, that in many ways his guiding sort of astrological principle was Venus, because I feel like his work, while intellectually brilliant, and his language and his incisive mind and his fresh metaphors and turn of language, there's all this sort of incredible Mercury, the Hermetic imagination going on.
Mhm.
Not underneath that, but perhaps suffusing that is the love of the beauty of life. And by beauty, I don't just mean like what we find aesthetically pleasing, but the the animated soulfulness of anything living. And that could be a being, that can be an idea, um, it can be a value. And I just often feel that Hillman was really in service to Aphrodite, but
Yeah.
like the cosmic Aphrodite. It's like the Aphrodite of the cosmos, of the living, sentient, um, um, sort of soul of the world, and that belongs to Aphrodite, and one of her, the heavenly Aphrodite, Aphrodite Urania, that was part of her uh, mythic being, her character, and it was related to beauty and justice and cosmic order, and yeah, so I
Mm.
yeah, so that piece I resonate to with him,
Yeah.
with him, yeah.
No, I get it. He was totally enamored with Aphrodite for sure. There's a lot of lover in him. But also the most prominent feature, thinking archetypally about this person was definitely like Mercury. He's definitely like a trickster type. His writing can really wrap you up
Mhm.
in its contradictions and its turns of phrase. And yeah, so hmm. It's interesting. So how does his particular approach, that phenomenological, experiential, reverent approach. How does that inform your approach to astrology?
Hmm. Well, I think this is all about the way in which the uh, my sense and drawing directly from Hillman that life, the psyche, and then this craft that can be employed in order to explore our nature, the quality of the time, and it's suffused with these symbols, that this all has to be engaged imaginatively. It has to be engaged in its own language. And so images from myth and alchemy, poetry, music, I mean, all of that is really the language of the soul. And so for me, astrology, see, I imagine that if people are interested in coming to have a reading with me or come to one of my classes, it's because they resonate with that. They resonate with the need for rich imaginal language by which to engage with and contemplate or reflect, work with what is happening in their life or who they are. So for me, that's Hillman's um, mm, presence and influence in my approach to astrology. Um, that this is a kind of um, astrology as a sort of cosmic poetic meditation.
Hmm. Yeah, I was thinking of an imaginal sandbox or something
Mhm.
like. So, could you give an example of how that might inform your reading? And this could be a theoretical example, or maybe if you could mention something about the astrological time that we're in now. I know
Mhm.
it's a new moon today,
Yeah.
but how would you then describe that in an archetypal astrology way? How would
Mhm.
that inform the way that you present the material or the data?
Well, I mean, it has a lot to do with the specifics of a person's chart, and let's say someone is just experiencing they have a loss of just energy, a loss of vitality. Like it could be a depression, that they're just feeling somewhat disconnected. And so we can look at the chart, and perhaps there's in their birth chart, perhaps there's some challenges regarding their Mars, right? Mars is related to a certain level of our sort of young um, vitality and um, sense of like fire. The way that we move with some fired and activity into life. So there could be that. It could possibly be, a Saturn transit to their Mars. I mean, so there are all these different potential configurations. But to just say to someone, oh, well, you've got Saturn sitting on your Mars, well, okay, that doesn't really mean anything. Even for even if I'm talking to another astrologer, that's information, but that isn't an opening, you see.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction. So it explains, but
Mhm.
does not mean anything.
No. So the meaning, I think, comes into the way we begin to explore what that might feel like or move like or look like. So we start to talk about like images of the devouring father, which belongs to Saturn as part of the Senex archetype. We could be looking at their natal Mars. If they have a Mars in Aries, let's just say that is like the warrior, right? So this is, and warriors by nature cannot be contained. Any thwarting of their capacity to move is in and of itself a kind of death. So we can be exploring just the that innate sort of need for independence and movement. And so to kind of, so this whole just move into the personified imagination, and that can be through myth. It could, sometimes people will share dream figures of theirs because that's their own psyche's articulation of, these places, these energies. But for me, I very often move into either mythic figures and stories to help draw these astrological principles into their personified animated being. Or we can talk about alchemy, which is more descriptive of process,
Hmm.
like kinds of movement, so, but see, getting people to feel into, to resonate with qualities of energy or figures that are that really seem to be inside the experience that they're having, or particular memories of themselves at a particular age. All those things, I think, it gets us moving with the psyche. And that's what starts to lead for insights to open. See, I think astrology, my way of looking at it, astrology doesn't provide answers. I think it provides extraordinary openings for further exploration. It helps us like pinpoint areas, like, oh, what's going on with this Mars? Okay, what's happening with desire? Like, and then someone's like, well, I don't know. I've sort of lost a sense of like what it is that I really want. It's like, okay, we've got to get into that. Like, what is that? What is the wanting that lives in this? And um
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm studying with Steve Eisenstadt at Pacifica,
Okay.
doing some
Yeah.
dream work
Yeah.
training with him. And one of the things he's always talking about, and I think this is probably from Hillman, is this idea of dreaming the dream forward.
Mm.
So not just freezing the dream in amber and having it be I don't know, a thing locked away that we can then study and analyze, but finding ways to continue the dream and see where these energies want to move, where there are openings for freedom or change. And so thinking about, okay, you're taking a look at someone's chart and you're helping them to develop this story around whatever's going on in their chart in their life. So like that idea of Saturn bearing down on someone's Mars energy, maybe the story gets invoked of a warrior locked up in a cell by a tyrant king or something. Would you then work with people in active imagination to help them keep that story alive, or what are some of the ways that you help them to work with whatever's happening?
Yeah, well, I don't explicitly lead people into active imaginations. I tend to, I mean, as these stories come up, I think in the reading, people will sort of take it with them and explore it. So for me, I feel maybe I'm more of a provocateur in that sense, in that I feel that my work is to evoke and help people connect to the figures or the images that are at work in them, and as um, indicated by the symbolism of the chart. I mean, those are pointers. The symbols in astrology are, on the one hand, they're multivalent, but they're also very explicit. I mean, zodiac signs, there's a constellation of figures and landscapes and sort of archetypes that belong to each zodiac sign. So it's both yeah, that there's a particularity, even though there might be a great variety of expression. So I think of my work as helping people connect with what that is for them, and then for them to accompany that, to explore that further on. Um, I often pose what I would understand as the kinds of questions that Saturn is asking. And then that becomes something that people can then write into or reflect into after the session. Um, so yeah, so my focus, I'm is translating the astrological symbols into life via the mythic or alchemical imagination, and then having that be what people can then take and then continue to explore. I mean, through active imagination or dream work, or they're in their analysis or therapy. I mean, whatever it is that they're doing.
Hmm. So you
Yeah.
would kind of leave that up to them to discover the way to actualize it in their life in some way.
Yeah, because I'm not a therapist. Like I sort
Mm.
of see, to me, I see a sort of line, in that way, and I think that the deepening into a relationship with these imaginal figures, especially with active imagination, because that's so, I mean, traditionally that's drawn from one's dreams, right? That you're deepening into the dream, just as you said. Um, my sensibility is that the moment you really start working with someone in their dreams, you're really stepping into the psyche, and I think that that's a very um, serious thing, and it's a much more therapeutic thing, whereas my approach to astrology is more sort of drawing things out than for the individual to work on and develop, as it serves them and supports them in what they're doing.
Hmm. I think it's good that you raised that point about kind of scope of practice. I guess I'd assumed that you were also a licensed clinician because of the,
No,
yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so you see a real distinction there, and I appreciate that because, yeah, I think the lines get pretty blurry with things like astrological consultation or even something like tarot reading.
mm,
Um, people are picking up a lot of therapeutic language. Instagram is like rife with social media psychotherapists sharing a lot of
right,
knowledge, which I think is great. People are starting to have more awareness around mental health,
good,
but I think it also leads to a blurring of
yeah.
professional lines in that way. So I wonder, do you have anything to say about that, or how you guide your students in that?
Yeah, well, so our program is not a clinical program. So, people are coming to be in the Jungian and Archetypal Studies because they might be already therapists. We have a number of students typically that are, and they're just wanting to deepen their understanding of this material so that it really informs and kind of vitalizes the work that they're doing. So, yeah, I mean, so I feel like the boundaries are pretty clear in terms of what people expect coming into our program. Um, so, for me, I think it's a matter of, recognizing the territory, like what really is part of the therapeutic container in that very sort of traditional sense. Dream work, really getting into, um, trauma, and that's work that needs, that kind of work requires much more consistent discussion and presence and all of that. Whereas an astrology session, usually it's one session. Maybe you meet the same person every 6 months or year, but it's in a way, it's like it's an event. Like it's some kind of almost ritual that we step into this kind of ritual place, and there's something very sacred and deep going on. And I hope that that's a point that I want to make, that I really feel astrology is a sacred art, and that's my sensibility, and that can be that the depth of that can be honored, while at the same time knowing that I'm not trying to heal or fix the problem that someone has come in with, but I can be very attentive and with a great amount of respect to the complexity of a situation that I won't be able to know. We can carefully, considerately, thoughtfully explore those parts of a chart that then can hopefully lead to greater insight on behalf of the person who I'm working with in that moment. But it's like trying to find the apt metaphors or mythic images or analogies that give the person a greater feeling for what they're dealing with, and how they then translate that specifically into their particular problem or situation. I mean, that's really theirs, but I'm trying to um, fan the fire of their imagination in relationship to that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ignite more curiosity, which will lead to inquiry. And yeah,
Yeah,
I'm reminded of, I think it was Jung's quote that neurosis is suffering without meaning.
that's right. That's right. I know, it's not amazing.
I mean, doesn't that just say it all?
Yes, right,
Like,
right.
because suffering is a given in this life, Buddha said so. I believe him. In my experience, that's true. But if we can infuse our life, the suffering and the joy and all of it, with a sense of deeper meaning, and the larger perspective that things like our dreams and mythology offer us,
Mhm.
it makes it a heck of a lot easier to bear the
That's
suffering
right.
that is unavoidable.
Yeah. See, I think one of the things that's healing, you're absolutely right, Brian. And I think one of the things that's the healing potential of astrology, um, whether one talks about myth or not in an astrology session, I don't think this is necessary. I think astrology, in the sort of meta sense, can be a healing practice because of the way it opens people up to the idea that their lives are embedded in a cosmos, in a sort of cosmological happening. The planets are moving somehow by this um, uh, synchronistic correlation. Those movements are in some kind of accord with the movements of my feeling, my mind, events in my life. They're somehow related to my character. Um, and to locate ourselves, to feel ourselves vesseled within a much larger cosmological story, I think is actually healing. So and so I think astrology does that, again, independent if someone is dips into the myths as ways of amplifying the astrological symbols. But I think that the when we do that, though, when we do turn to myths and things like alchemy, we get an even closer, tighter hit of the way in which, I mean, to put it in a very sort of Hillmanian way, our souls are embedded in myth. And to find the myths that seem to echo or mirror some part of us, I think, again, see it moves us into a larger story. And see, Hillman talked about this as being, this is in his magnum opus, Revisioning Psychology. This is related to the fourth movement called dehumanizing, which is how when we move out of a personalistic vision of who we are, and we begin to recognize that there are these daimons or gods, or the soul has needs, and part of our responsibility is to cultivate those needs, to respond to them with curiosity and attentiveness and respect. See, we're not caught up in our small ego anymore, that maybe we are in some sort of deep relationship with a much larger plurality that makes up who we are. And that when we have a responsibility to that, we have a responsibility to the soul. See, that's that, like, not taking things personally. See, I think astrology gives us a hit of that. And even if people don't think about it in these terms, I think this is what's on some level like working on them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Mm.
Like I was thinking as you're speaking about kind of like the core fears that I've had, and probably everybody, I think it's universal, but the sense that I'm all alone, that nobody understands me, um, things like that. And when you start to see your experience reflected in stories and myths, whether they're Greek myths or a movie that you watched last night on Netflix, there's a resonance there. And yeah, like a sense that I'm not alone, that I'm
Mm-hmm.
not the first person and the only person to go through this, whatever it is.
Right.
And yeah, so I mean, there's something about astrology too, like even without the Greek mythology, when you read someone's chart, it's already a story,
Yes.
right? Even without getting into another reference.
Right. And I mean, and I would say it's already stories. I mean, I think a chart is, there are multiple stories, that not just one. And I mean, I do think
Yeah, it's like Game of Thrones. There's multiple storylines going on, and you can drop in on any particular storyline
that's
at any
right.
moment,
That's
and it's
right.
a whole different kind of dynamic going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, see, I do think the myths are there, they're embedded in it. I mean, the planets carry the names of the gods. So we're already in the mythic imagination, whether we're, thinking about it. Um, but yes, when you put Mars and Saturn together, there's there's a way that those two energies dance together. They're and different ways, but there are some fundamental principles, that tempos or rhythms that are going to be there, or be the cause of the trouble, or be the giftedness. So yeah, they're there.
Well, learning a little bit about astrology through osmosis. I bought Debbie Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche,
Mhm.
because I saw it at the used bookstore in Montreal. And I thought, I don't know, this looks impressive. I don't know who this guy is, but I know what Psyche is. I know what Cosmos is. This sounds pretty cool. And
Yeah.
so I brought it home to her, and she was like, oh my God, this book is like really well respected and revered, and it's a magnum opus and
Right.
all this. Um, but definitely one of the most intimidating books I've ever seen in my life. Like,
Mm.
not only is it like 5 pounds, but the type is like very tiny and densely packed, and there's footnotes. And wow,
Mm.
that guy is, talk about magician type, real high intellect.
Yes.
But the little bit that I have picked up has created I never thought about it really until this moment, but it's created a psychological transformation in me.
Mm.
So when Mars stops being just a name of a planet and it becomes this fiery warrior god, it changes my relationship to it. And then even
Mhm.
realizing that the days of the week are named after these figures and
Mhm.
archetypal energies changes my relationship to time, and
Mhm.
bringing attention to, like, well, what is the quality of this Mercury's day? We're recording this
Mhm.
on Tuesday, and it's hard to get until you learn other languages. So it
Yeah,
became
the French is the easiest.
yeah,
Yeah.
it became way more apparent to me when I was living in Montreal and learning
Mm,
French and going,
right.
oh, it's all right there, but in English it's kind of hidden, right?
Mhm.
But when you realize, okay, Mercury's Day, well, what's Mercury all about? Well, maybe that would be a good day to book an interview with Safron, because he's a messenger. He's a god of like communication, and right.
Mhm.
So that like just that knowing what's behind these names deepens my experience of life and enriches my life and gives it a greater sense of meaning.
Mhm.
So it's actually quite simple the way that it can positively en- enrich your life. Um, yeah, just that. I don't know. Just sharing that.
Yeah,
It just kind
no,
of like hit home for me.
yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that you're giving another example of this sort of this idea of qualities of time. I mean, just that if we imagine then that the week itself, that there are certain principles that were understood by, the ancients to be revered or belonging, that this particular day belongs to this god. And so activities that fall under their auspices are favored. I mean, that gives us a whole different relationship to the week and to our time, and what might be invited. So this is it's a very imaginative way, it's a very ancient way of thinking. I mean, this is the case, in the Yoruba tradition. The days of the week are belonging to particular Ifa, their gods. I mean, this is a very um, um, deep, old, primary modality of what it is to be human, which is to be in some connection, awareness, attentiveness to the powers that participate in the very like panoply of life. It's only, and you write about this on your website. It's only in our modern, and particularly modern Western world, that the ego and our rational consciousness has sort of eclipsed the idea that there are any other forms of intelligence to which we are inextricably linked. And so astrology is a very clear way that we can imagine back into that kind of awareness. But then, of course, so is depth psychology. I mean, depth psychology is all about the um, awakening to and relating to our inner multiplicity, isn't it? Yeah, the psyche, and
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
it's just like they're different modalities, right?
Mm.
Like even in my yoga practice, it's very symbolic and archetypal what I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing. It's like an
Mm-hmm.
internalization of ritual that I
Yeah.
can see reflections of in alchemical text, this marriage of the sun and the moon that I'm enacting through my
Mm-hmm.
breathing practice, breathing through different nostrils and equalizing those energies. Like, so there's all of these different ways to engage. But I mean, this is the thing. Once I came to the archetypal understanding, first I think maybe through, I remember trying to read Hillman years ago and I couldn't get it. So I had a blue fire sitting on my shelf for 15 years or something. And it wasn't until I was in my 40s and had like a foundational understanding of Jungian concepts that I could actually penetrate, or I could receive it, whatever. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, I lost my train of thought. I got thinking about my bookshelf. It's
That's
Mercury's
yeah.
Day.
Yeah, and it's a very, yeah, I know. The moment I start thinking about our bookshelves, we're like, oh, well, yes, it draws our thoughts into a million different directions.
Yeah, I can't even pick up the thread,
Oh,
but
okay.
that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. I'm not a professional broadcaster, just a person who's curious about arcane things. Well, maybe that's a good place to end it. We've been
Yeah.
speaking for a while, and maybe it's
Okay.
a sign of my mid-afternoon slump. But I'd like you maybe just to tell people what's coming up in terms of any courses that you're offering. Are you doing things
Oh,
online now?
yeah. Okay. Thanks. So at the very end of July, I will be teaching a public program through Pacifica on the elemental imagination of the zodiac signs. And
Mm.
so this is going to be very much based on a lot of what you and I have been talking about, and Hillman's approach. And so I'm going to be exploring each sign of the zodiac, but particularly through fire, earth, air, and water, and the way in which alchemy and alchemy's incredibly particularity around the elements and sort of kinds of fire and kinds of water and processes of change that happen via the fire calcinatio or water and solutio, and the way that we can see that at work in the consciousness that belongs to the different zodiac signs. So this is going to be a blend of Greek myth and alchemy to just really get us imagining into the elemental intelligence at work in the different zodiac signs. So that's going to be a 6-week program. That's the next big thing that I have going on that I'm preparing.
Hmm.
And people can find that on the Pacifica website or on my website.
Is like bringing those alchemical ideas into it adds another layer of complexity to it. Like there's more, like alchemy can be pretty far out and very
Mm,
complex and very mercurial.
yes,
There's no clear concept anywhere. Like nobody
right,
agrees on anything.
right.
Um, what does that add to the archetypal astrology?
Well, I think, so not approaching alchemy in the sense of like teaching people alchemy and trying to understand like the stages and the levels. I'm letting all of that fall away and really just drawing on some of the core ideas in alchemy about how there are different, for example, different kinds of fire. There's terrestrial fire, there's celestial fire, and those things, when understood psychologically, are related to like the ways in which we get inspired about something. That's a very Sagittarian celestial fire, like being caught with an idea and then going off in pursuit of that, the whole sort of fiery nature of being on a quest,
Mm.
as opposed to we could call like a metabolic or terrestrial fire of Aries, and that whole uh, kind of fundamental sort of drive to compete and to kind of get into a sort of sensate um, pushing, or the instinct to go as far as your fear will allow you to go in order to discern something of the depth of your courage. See, I think that's a very metabolic alchemical fire to do that, to be drawn to do that, which is very Aries. So I'm I'm
Mm.
drawing on, in a way, like the images of alchemy to just get us imagining into um, these kind of movements, that belong to the psychology of the sign, so to speak. So yeah, so
Mm.
so
Yeah.
It's so again, it's very Hellmanian. See, so Jung and Edinger were much more perhaps process oriented with alchemy, like the stages, but Hellman is more like you dip in and you take what's nourishing to get into the ideas. And so I'm more in that mode.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it adds some really interesting nuances to what's already there in astrology, or even like a
Yeah.
rudimentary understanding of elemental
Yes.
astrology. Because, yeah, those different types of fire that you described, as
Hmm.
soon as you started to describe it, I totally get it. Like,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about rituals of transformation quite a lot these
Mm.
days, particularly as they relate to um, plant medicines and
Mm.
psychedelics and psychedelic therapies coming into vogue now. And one of
Mm.
the things I think is really lacking is that terrestrial fire that happens
Mm.
when I go on a pilgrimage to a place like Peru and in the jungle. Like, I have to take my body
Mm.
somewhere. It's different than taking a meditative journey in my mind as I sit in lotus posture, and my
Right.
imagination is traveling through the stars. But that sense that, no, I have to get my body somewhere, and my body has to undergo an ordeal or a transformation of some kind, as well as my psychology. So
Mm.
I really
Hmm.
get a sense of that difference there. So
Hmm.
that sounds really interesting. And I know at least one person who's going to sign up for that.
Oh, really? Oh,
Well,
great.
yeah,
Debbie?
Debbie's totally going to sign up for that.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
great. And so your website is the archetypal eye.
Correct. Yes. Um, and then Pacifica is simply pacifica.edu. So the information on that program is available on either website. Yeah.
And your Instagram is really great too. I love the
Oh,
images that
thanks.
you select.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
No, they're beautiful and they're evocative. And the astrology that you put out there in the post is just enough to get me kind of like get the imaginative juices flowing,
Mm.
but not too much to overwhelm a layperson like me. So I appreciate that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think my whole idea there is that I don't necessarily want to translate what the astrological, let's say, transit is, but I trying to give an image that really, as you just said, like evokes something of what belongs to that archetypal configuration and letting people just resonate with it and sort of develop their own sort of archetypal literacy, but in a visual
Mm.
way. So yeah, so that's the fantasy at work, at least in
I
my
like
Instagram
that. There's
page.
there's been such a push in psychology over the past number of years to help people develop more emotional intelligence, but I like this idea of helping people develop archetypal intelligence. Hmm. Oh.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's part of my mission too. Is
Yeah, I noticed that in your journal blog post about like the four, the warrior and the magician. Yeah, I thought that was really well done. So
Yeah, well, that's drawn on a lot of the work of Robert Moore,
right.
who had this great adversarial relationship with James Hillman that I don't know, we shouldn't get into, but I
Oh, I'm not
love.
familiar with this chapter from history.
Oh, well, it's fascinating because they obviously interacted quite a bit. Robert Moore is from Texas, and then they both spent time in the men's movement that
Hmm.
Robert Bly and Michael Meade got going. So they crossed paths quite a lot, and Robert Moore had some um, issues with Hillman being a post-Jungian, and so you'd always hear them like make comments. Mostly, you'd hear Robert Moore make more comments about Hillman,
Mm.
but I love their kind of relationship because they're different types, and
Hmm.
you can see where they like rub up against each other. But I think there's room for both, and I think like because Moore is such a structuralist, like he really gets into all the all the deep structures of the psyche, and he's very much he was a scholar of comparative religion and
Mhm.
spirituality, and so he integrates a lot of the structuralists, and Hillman was like a post-structuralist, and so there's all that. It's just kind of
Yeah.
fun, kind of
Yeah.
look back in time, and that whole period in the 90s when Hillman was getting a lot of attention
Mhm.
for his work, and I think more as well in a particular realm, especially like with the men's movement.
Right.
That's just kind of a special time, and I love listening back to old recordings of lectures from that period, pre-internet, when people were buying books and going to lectures and
Right.
you know subscribing to weird little Jungian newsletters,
Mhm.
and to the spring journal that Hillman
Right.
started, like
Mhm.
just totally, it's fun for me as a child of the 90s to listen back to that, because I was too young to really engage with any of that stuff at the time.
Mhm.
But there's a particular vibe to it all
Mhm.
that I remember, and that
Yeah.
I kind of am nostalgic for at times in this
Yeah.
hyper fast mercurial internet age.
Right.
It's just kind of
Yes.
slower, like I'm
Yeah.
listening to a lecture by Robert Moore right now. It's 7 hours long.
Yeah. Love
It's
it.
like I just, yeah, I totally just gonna slip into that mode for half a day, and it's great.
Yeah. That's great.
Well, thanks so much. Before we spoke, sometimes I'll do this, and I don't always tell people about it, but I pulled a tarot card, and I pulled
Oh.
La Papesse.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and she's very much, I think, reflective of you and your scholarly aptitude, and you're willing
Mm.
to like sit in the depths, and yeah,
Mm.
so that's great. That's an
Mm.
image
Yeah.
for me,
Yeah. Wow.
and maybe
Thanks.
for the listeners too. Look up that card from, yeah, the Marseille deck. It's
Mm.
my favorite.
Mm.
Well, thanks so much for spending time with me. It's been really fun. I think I asked Debbie, what I should talk to you about, and she just said, I want to know more about how she got into astrology and how she weaves the archetypal psychology into it and all that. And I
Yeah.
think we really covered that. And,
Yeah.
I think if I have a good sense of the way this all melds together, then I think anybody with more knowledge than me will get something out of it too. So
Mm.
thank
Well,
you.
thank you for your really thoughtful questions, and um, it was just a great conversation. So really, just lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, well, take care.
Yeah. You too, Brian.